Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Racial Violence Hub. I'm Shireen Razak, the Penny Canner Endowed Chair in Gender Studies at UCLA and the founder of the Hub. The Hub's purpose is to foster scholarship and scholarly exchange on racial violence from a feminist point of view. This is the Genocide series, which began in October of 2021, which seems a lifetime away. And it continues until May of 2022. Those of us who write on racial violence wrestle with a number of issues that led to the creation of this series: how to think about the politics of genocidal violence and the interconnections between its different registers, how to consider the transnational links between genocidal states, how to write about racial violence without spectacularizing it and trading in pain and suffering, how to minimize harm to the families and communities of those we write about. These many questions, and especially the question of how to understand resistance, have been central for the past few months. Thus far, we've had sessions on categorical violence and the traffic in Asian women, settler state genocidal tactics in Israel-Palestine, genocidal management through reformism in North America, administrative genocide against Muslim populations in South Asia, theorizing an indigenous feminist voice in relation to mass violence against Ottoman Armenians. And today we come to genocide in the Americas, sexual and labor slavery and armed conflict in Guatemala, dying a slow death in prisons in Canada. We have two events remaining after this one, so stay tuned. On April 1st, we will have Land, Climate Change, and Genocidal Violence in North America and South Asia, with Dr. Jaskiran Dillon on the securitization of the Canadian northern border in the wake of climate catastrophe, and Dr. Athar Zia on neocolonial de-development in Indian-occupied Kashmir, with a comment by Dr. Sunaina Mehra. We will close the series with an address by Professor Todney Thomas of Harvard Divinity School on Feeling Genocide, Black Church Arson. So today's session, we have two speakers. First, Dr. Sylvia Posacco is a reader in social anthropology in the Department of Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck University of London. Her interdisciplinary research interests are in gender and sexuality studies and violence, conflict, and genocide studies. She has studied ethnographically insurgent movements in Guatemala, the archives of transnational adoption across sites and temporalities, and most recently, forensic archives, bioinformation, and cultures of evidence. Dr. Posacco's talk today is entitled Zepo Zarco, Guatemala, Bodying Forth and the Forensic Aesthetics of Witnessing in the Courtroom and Beyond. The second speaker will be Dr. Jen Rinaldi, who is an associate professor in legal studies at Ontario Tech University in Toronto, Canada. Her research takes up how non-normative bodies are read, marked, and produced in and through sociolegal discourse. Her talk is entitled The Slow and Sudden Carceral Violences of the Canadian Colonial Project. Our commentator today is Dr. Shannon Speed. Dr. Speed is a tribal citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. She is director of the American Indian Studies Center and a professor of gender studies and anthropology here at UCLA. Dr. Speed has worked for the last 2 decades in Mexico and in the United States on issues of indigenous autonomy, sovereignty, gender, neoliberalism, violence, migration, social justice, and activist research. Her most recent book, Incarcerated Stories, Indigenous Women, Migrants, and Violence in the Settler Colonial State, won the Best Subsequent Book Award of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association in 2019. And a Choice Outstanding Academic Title in 2020. So we have a remarkable group today, and we will begin with Dr. Posacco.
So I shall begin. So good evening, everyone. I would like to thank Professor Shirin Razak for her invitation to join the Violence Hub seminar series. I have learned a lot from previous sessions, and I hope that my presentation might connect to some of the themes and the problems that were addressed in previous events. I also wanted to thank Professor Shannon Speed and Dr. Jan Rinaldi and very much look forward to our conversation. My specific entry point for thinking through the theme of genocide in the Americas is the analysis of pre-trial proceedings that I was able to observe in 2012 for the case that has come to be known as the Sepur-Sarko case. I was in Guatemala conducting fieldwork on transnational adoption circuits from Guatemala to Europe that took place during the Guatemalan conflict, a conflict that took place between 1960 until the peace accords that were signed in 1996. I should also say that I have been researching different aspects of the conflict since 1999, and this long-term research engagement has clearly marked my approach to the legal proceedings and the revelations and occlusions that I saw unfolding through the judicial scene of the court in 2012. The juridical scene provides a specific entry point into violence and into gendered and racialized violence. Whilst it purports to be about justice, I would contend that it is in fact a complex and layered scene of violence which poses profound ethical, political, and representational challenges. As I grapple with the problem of presence and absence, materialization and effacement, aporias of memory, and the coloniality of the law, in this presentation I offer a very abridged version of a longer paper that I would be very happy to share if anybody wants to read the full text. So in September 2012, 15 Maya Kekchi women and 3 Maya Kekchi men appeared as witnesses at the pre-trial hearing in the Court of High-Risk Crimes in the tower that is part of the Palace of Justice compound in Guatemala City. These hearings were related to events that took place in a military base near the village of Sepur-Sarco in Izabal, in the east of the country between 1982 and 1986. The events were framed as the ground for the first major case of sexual violence committed by the Guatemalan army during the Guatemalan conflict to reach the courts, and the first case of sexual and labor slavery in our conflict to be heard in a national court. The Palace of Justice is part of a large modernist complex built in the late 1960s following the demolition of a vast penitentiary facility that held political prisoners during the dictatorship of General Jorge Ubico y Castañeda. In 2013, the building rose to prominence in the national consciousness and internationally as the site of the trial for genocide and crimes against humanity of Efraín Ríos Montt, an ex-army general and de facto head of state, and of General José Mauricio Rodríguez Sánchez, the ex-director of military intelligence of the much-feared intelligence service unit known as G2. The legal proceedings against Rodriguez Sanchez led to his acquittal because of lack of evidence. Ríos Montt was found guilty on both charges and sentenced to 80 years in prison. However, in May 2013, the Guatemalan Supreme Court of Justice overturned the verdict, deeming it unconstitutional and ordering his immediate release, so much so that Ríos Montt died in 2018, having evaded prison. 6 months prior to the high-profile trial of Ríos Montt and Rodriguez Sanchez, a series of pre-trial hearings on events that took place in the army base near the village of Sepur-Sarco was already marking the profound role of trials in the articulation of a juridical unconscious as public interplay of trauma and justice in Guatemala. The Sepur-Sarco hearings were not as widely reported, but made their own claim to historical significance, as they dealt with the Guatemalan army's involvement in systematic sexual violence against a group of Maya Kekchi women who were routinely assaulted and also forced to work with no remuneration in army barracks between 1982 and 1986, a period that included the years of General Ríos Montt's rule. The hearings specifically dealt with the role of the Guatemalan army in systematic sexual assault and sexual and labor slavery, and they aim to establish that such charges should be investigated, thus determining the viability of future judicial proceedings. When the case eventually came to trial in 2016, it was a widely publicized event that attracted considerable media attention in Guatemala and internationally. The trial culminated with 2 convictions, and the survivors and their communities were eventually granted reparation measures. Now, Shoshana Fellman has argued that trials, especially those that are presented as watershed moments of reckoning with histories of violence, conflict, and mass atrocities, are sites of articulation of the juridical unconscious. Fellman's analysis proceeds from an examination of the Ackman trial and includes an extensive discussion of the O.J. Simpson trial. Such trials, Fellman argues, are structured around the peculiar conceptual articulation of law and trauma. Their function is not primarily or exclusively to establish guilt, innocence, or absolution, but rather to, and I quote, to restore the world's balance by reestablishing the law's monopoly on violence, and by conceiving of justice not simply as punishment, but as a marked symbolic exit from the injuries of a traumatic history, a liberation from violence itself, end of quote. Fellman's contention is that although trials attempt to articulate and contain, the very performance of the trial entails reenactment and repetition. Trials depend on testimonial practices, and in this frame, questions of authenticity continue to be fundamentally concerned with ascertaining or validating the veracity of suffering. To a significant extent, then, the victim's suffering is always also partly on trial, and a more robust regime or frame of validation is required to rectify the idiosyncrasies and fragmentation of the witness's accounts. So in this paper, I focus on the relationship between witnessing and trials as it relates to performative processes of materialization and subjectification. I focus on bodying forth, that is, on how voicing seems to always be tied to the body. Fellman also observes that the speaking body challenges assumptions about the distinction between matter and language. More specifically, the speaking body's role in the courtroom means that the act of testimony is not merely discursive, but rather it participates in the staging, she says, of a dramatically physical theater of justice. These theoretical arguments bring the question of witnessing back to the body. They provide a preamble and an entry point for an exploration of how the Sepur-Sarko case offers a glimpse into indigenous approaches to justice and another way to think about trauma and aporias of justice. More specifically, in this paper, I show how bodying forth progressively appears to be tied to a body. In the course of the different depositions, the witnesses gradually and fragmentarily conjured up the body of Dominga Cook Cock on the riverbank, washing army uniforms under duress in the company of her daughters and as the victim of assault. Dominga Cook Cock was gradually spoken into presence and precariously positioned between remembrance and oblivion through testimonial accounts. The processes of bodying forth in the witnesses' statements are tied to precarious forms of materialization and subjectification. However, the witnesses' testimonies are increasingly seen as having to be supplemented and perhaps supplanted by equally performative imaginaries of forensic witnessing that are called on to validate testimonial accounts. The scientific practices and evidentiary forms of forensic anthropology that are produced through forensic exhumation elicit forensic modes of bodying forth. These dynamics play out in the courtroom and in the broader Guatemalan body politic, where forensic imaginaries circulate widely. Forensic aesthetics of witnessing are closely intertwined with anthropological epistemologies and modes of representation that have emerged over the past 30 years, as anthropologists have actively participated in creating accounts of the Guatemalan conflict and its violent aftermath. So I foreground the practices of testimony as they unfolded in the courtroom, focusing on bodying forth and the circulation of pain through voicing in the witnesses' accounts. Bodying forth in the testimonial accounts is then contrasted with modes of forensic witnessing that appeal to legal and scientific epistemologies to offer frames of validation or super truths, which the operatic testimonial accounts cannot provide. Different modes of witnessing are tied to forms of materialization that may or may not result in returning a body, a face, or a name to the dead. So the Sepur-Sarko pretrial hearings are sites of production of multiple forms of embodied subjectivity marked by profound experiences of violence and social suffering. The work undertaken by the legal team with the witnesses over the years before the hearings was notably occluded from view at the pretrial hearings. The pretrial hearings were the products of rehearsals painstakingly undertaken to ensure that the experiences of the witnesses might be translated in the rhetoricity proper of the court setting and be heard in the frames and terms set out by the law. The overarching narrative of the events that emerged from multiple accounts offered by the witnesses individually had the compelling effect of holding the attention of those present. Small recurrent details cumulatively lent facticity to the accounts. The holes in the ground, the calabasas, the holes where people were kept captive, were a narrative anchor, the beginning of a fact. Another was the riverbank, where Dominga Cook and her daughters appeared alive and then dead. Subtle processes of subjectification and materialization performatively unfolded as the court proceedings elicited a multiplicity of voices and perspectives, but also multiple modes of witnessing. So Vina Das proposes the expression body and forth to refer to the relationship between language, pain, embodiment, and meaning, and to grapple with the processes of subjectification and materialization in play in witnessing. Pain and its transitivity moves us beyond the logic of evidence and facticity based on notions of truth and the verification of legal and scientific discourses, as processes of bodying forth challenge the epistemologies of law and science and the logics of legal and forensic technologies. The multiple and complex dilemmas of testimony are restaged in the Sepur-Sarko hearings through the tenuous emergence of Dominga Cook and her daughters into discourse and their fragile and transient materialization on the riverbank, where Dominga Cook is said to have been seen washing those army uniforms, assaulted, killed, and hastily buried. The performative domain conjured up by the narratives of the Sepur-Sarko witnesses engender a fragile, peri-performative space, a sort of neighborhood of the performative utterance. I think it was Yves Sedgwick that gave this definition of the peri-performative, which immediately appears to be populated not just by Dominga Cook and her daughters, but also by other women and those killed in the holes in the ground. Dominga Cook and her daughters remain faceless, but are progressively spoken into presence through the course of the hearings in the domain of the peri-performative and the condition of adjacency. Witnessing here is also concerned, therefore, with effacement in discourse. Effacement in discourse foregrounds the importance of refraining from inscribing processes of bodying forth within the logics of truth, trauma, and the metaphysics of presence. The analytical effort is to reimagine the status of practices of speaking and their relationship to differentiated, precarious, and transactional forms of materialization and mattering, as those indigenous bodying forths that emerged in the pretrial hearings. Bodying forth and the trace structures of witnessing stands in juxtaposition to the logics of and the regimes of the evidence of law and science. When questioned, the Sepur-Sarko witnesses repeatedly seemed unable to recall dates or the year in which events had taken place. But the witnesses' ability to recall operated through different logics. They could describe how high the milpa, the maize field, was at the time of the force's appearances, but they struggled to situate events temporally in the terms mobilized by the law. In contrast, forensic witnessing in the context of the pretrial hearings operated in the domain of certainty and was mobilized as a truth-making device to corroborate the narratives of survivors. The framing of forensics as a superior truth-telling technology that can bypass the idiosyncrasies of the witness's account and offer scientific facts that can be translated into truths in terms that can be recognized by the law purposefully elides the realities of forensic analysis and the difficulties tied to the fact that though remains might speak, it may not be clear what they actually say. So, as Keenan and Wiseman have argued, the emergence of expert knowledge on forensic science and forensic anthropology in the juridical space of trials concerned with human rights violations is tied to a momentous shift in the organization of the epistemologies underpinning practices of bearing witness. Bearing witness through the document, as in the Nuremberg trials, or through the witness, as in the Eichmann trial, has seemingly been supplanted by new practices of bearing witness through bones and human remains. Not only are bones said to speak, but they are said to speak truth. As Keenan and Wiseman note about the rise of forensic anthropology, and I quote, these processes did more than introduce new forms of evidence. They did nothing less than shift the conditions by which that evidence became audible and visible, the way in which juridical facts were constructed and understood, end of quote. Forensic inflections of empiricism and forensic objectivist epistemologies aim to consolidate or validate the necessary differential and differentiated account of the witness. In their increasingly wide circulation through the Guatemalan body politic, they purport to speak a truth that is superior to the witness's accounts. They give genocide a face. And this is an artist activist installation that says, El rostro del genocidio, the face of genocide. Although forensic anthropology has worked to support individuals and communities affected by the Guatemalan conflict in their quests for justice, the rhetorical framing of bones, speaking unambiguously, remains problematic in view of the fragmentary and operatic testimony and unassailable truth spoken by the witnesses, whose testimonies produced the tenuous bodying forth of Dominga Cook and her daughters, and allowed their lives and deaths to appear. The coarse narrative of forensic positivism glosses over the ambiguities and inconsistencies that in reality beset the making of scientific objects. The rhetorical appeal to scientific objectivity actively obfuscates the actual practice of forensic science and the challenges inherent in the production of what might register as identifications in the parameters set by law and science. Furthermore, forensic technoscientific apparatuses for the documentation of sexual assault have in fact been shown to lead to a re-victimization of the survivors. Historically, Indigenous women, Indigenous men, and the poor have actively engaged with the judicial system and the oppressive regimes that have sustained them. In the Sepor Sarko case, the witnesses asked for justice, and it is through their accounts, in all the idiosyncrasies and fragmentariness, the bodying forth operates by making pain circulate across bodies. These bodying forths come to constitute their own unique modes of differential justice. These bodying forths are differential modes of witnessing, and they did not exclusively pluralize the law. Rather, and fundamentally against all odds, and against a Spanish-speaking law, the memories and bodying forths tied to Dominga Cook and those who perished in the holes in the ground continued to push through the testimonies of the Maya Kikchi witnesses beyond pluralizing analytics. They worked to unsettle the coloniality of the law and its regimes of evidence. They offered a glimpse into the complex and non-univocal indigenous gendering of bodying forth as it oscillated between the strategic essentialisms expressed by the witnesses as they spoke of violence as tied to a gendered condition. Por ser mujer me pasó esto. and gendering as violence, as they reflected on how they were pharmacopolitically gendered by the injections forced upon them by the soldiers. While a feminist anthropology can attend to such scenes of force, specifically by providing an ethnographic account of the domain of the peri-performative, that which is in the neighborhood of the performative utterance, the emergence of forensic modes of witnessing tied to the logics of evidence of forensic anthropology ossifies this complex and shifting terrain, appealing to the seemingly self-evident, unmediated narrative of the forensic remain, but evading questions about the relationship between forensic witnessing and the witnesses' accounts. The politics of forensic humanitarianism, forensic paternalism, and forensic anthropology's seemingly uncontestable capacity to produce super truths, where survivors were able to only offer fragmentary and operatic accounts, are also occluded from view. If trials entail an articulation of the juridical unconscious, as Feldman has suggested, what remains hidden or legally illegible is the way anthropological modes of witnessing may be implicated in these processes. The juridical unconscious at play in the sepulchral pretrial hearings, therefore, also unsettles anthropology's relationship to bodying forth in testimonial accounts and proximity to forensic witnessing and its aesthetics or revelation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for inviting me. My name is Jen Rinaldi. I am humbled to be on such an esteemed panel alongside scholars who've long informed my own work. And that goes back to the previous workshops I've had the pleasure of sitting in across this academic year. I'm joining you today from Toronto, Canada, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is land covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. So my privilege to present to you from this land is directly related to my government's longstanding refusal to uphold treaty obligations. I'd like to talk to you today about how the Canadian carceral system functions as a tool of settler colonial governance. Specifically, Canada's mass incarceration of Indigenous populations continues the long-standing colonial project of geographic and demographic reorganization in the service of land and resource acquisition. Then those confined to carceral space experience family separation, bodily and mental harm, and death, in many instances, either sudden or slow. These are outcomes which illustrate that settler colonialism has always been and continues to be genocidal in character. I should note then that the content of my work today references violence against women, Indigenous women in particular, including physical and sexual assault. So this unbroken through line of the colonial relation and its methods of displacement and annihilation has persisted because of its capacity for rearrangement and recoding. In honor of this workshop theme, I'd like to explore in particular an historical example of state co-optation of feminist rhetorics to sanitize carceral investments. This will be some practical work on the use of theory, and it'll serve as early chapter writing for a book I'm co-authoring with a colleague of mine that will draw from prisoner writing found in a quarterly publication called Cell Count. And Cell Count is a quarterly paper that for 27 years has been distributed to prisoners, that has included prisoner writing and has also gone out to ex-prisoners and families and community. Cell Count publishes prisoner art, some of which will be featured in my slides today. And then the premise of this wider project will be to unravel the work that the carceral model does to caged people, even and especially when that model is reinforced through reform. Let's see if I can manage to get my slides on the screen. Everyone can see them? Okay. The archive I've been working on, the archive I've been working with was founded at a time that coincides with a dramatic shift in women's corrections in Canada. A government commissioned task force on federally sentenced women assembled in 1989 and submitted to the Canadian federal government a watershed report in 1990. It was titled Creating Choices. And it was touted as being the first penal document in the world to recommend reshaping a correctional system in response to gender. The report used national survey data to show that federally sentenced women are vulnerable to violence on the basis of gender, and that this was a key contributor to their criminal records. This uniquely gendered experience, according to the task force, called for a targeted, gender-specific correctional plan. The task force was also the first in Canadian history to include representation of Indigenous women. As the preface of the document indicates, the women involved had, to quote, reservations about the mandate and organization of the task force, but they opted to participate due, in their own words, to a deep felt concern for the many citizens of our many nations who suffer daily at the hands of the criminal justice system. These women at least had a chance to identify the processes of criminalization that uniquely impact their communities. We might call their work a kind of harm reduction measure, or we can call this a kind of casualty management if we're quoting Dylan Rodriguez, whom I think is here today. They certainly informed how this document began. The early first lines of this text read that pain is often the precursor to change. This was very much the case for the task force, whose vision for change is built primarily on descriptions and experiences of suffering. These are the first opening lines of Creating Choices. And those descriptions came directly from federally sentenced women, interviewed through the course of the task force's investigation and quoted in the body of the document itself. The report cited 5 key principles as foundational to building a holistic approach to women's corrections. 1, empowerment, particularly building self-esteem as a corrective to abuse. 2, meaningful choices to break cycles of dependency. 3, respect and dignity for self and others, particularly other prisoners and prison staff. 4, supportive environment encompassing political, physical, financial, emotional, and spiritual conditions. And 5, and lastly, a shared responsibility to foster independence and self-reliance. These 5 principles could be operationalized through smaller facilities and a more dynamic security measure protocol. The term facility itself was a deliberate rhetorical move, reflecting a philosophical commitment to rehabilitation in place of punishment. Correctional Services Canada accepted every recommendation made in Creating Choices, including the adoption of this 5-principle framework, and they claimed the report would be the driving force to restructuring women's in the year 2000. So across its phase out, federally sentenced women were transferred to 5 newly built regional facilities that make up today's women's correctional system. The report also led to the establishment of healing lodges for Indigenous ceremonial use and communal living, another kind of carceral facility. The first opened in 1995 on Mackinac First Nation or rural Saskatchewan, and remains the only healing lodge that houses and serves women prisoners among the 10 healing lodges that are now part of our carceral system. Creating Choices catalyzed the first major crisis featured in the archive I'm working with. The early issues of Cell Count documented developments in 1997 related to efforts to close the prison for women. This process prompted prisoners in maximum security to work to prevent their transfers to Kingston Penitentiary, which was an all-male maximum security prison. And they were to be transferred there while construction on women's facilities were still underway, because there was nowhere else to hold maximum security women prisoners. So the women targeted published an open letter condemning the transfers for perpetuating violence against women by exposing them to the carceral conditions and lack of gender responsivity that creating choices actually condemned. The letter was published in full in Cell Count and read aloud at a candlelit vigil and community meeting at Queen's University that gathered First Nations, AIDS service organizations, and legal groups protesting the transfers. The letter drew directly from an incident in '94, where 6 women prisoners at P4W were placed in segregation for what they described as several officers beating up on one Indigenous prisoner unjustifiably, provoking other prisoners to come to this individual's aid by restraining the officers. P4W guards demanded the prisoners involved be transferred to Kingston Pen. Instead, at first, Kingston Pen came to them. The P4W warden called for an institutional emergency response team from the all-male maximum security prison, and this tactical team proceeded to abruptly and aggressively extract from their cells those original 6 prisoners and 3 additional prisoners already in the segregation unit. So across 2 days, those women were subjected to video recorded strip and cavity searches and were kept in restraints without their clothes. Cell Count published a piece by Kim Pate, executive director of the Elizabeth Fry Societies, which was an organization that had participated in the task force that produced Creating Choices. Pate described the video that was later released to the public. I'll quote her at length. "I was in the prison for women shortly after 8 women had been assaulted, stripped, shackled, and left naked by a male emergency response team. Everything the women told me that day was eventually confirmed via the videotapes created by their captors. The video showed that there was no emergency or riot in progress. It showed the women being roused from sleep, their clothes being forcibly removed by men. They were assaulted and subjected to these searches while shackled. They were left naked in their cells with a paper gown tied around their necks, glasses smashed, medication denied." 5 of those women were then transferred to Kingston Pen, satisfying the guards' demands that they be transferred. And there they spent months in segregation. And when the matter was resolved, 3 years passed, and several of the women who underwent this ordeal were the ones selected for transfer again to Kingston Penitentiary as P4W was shutting down and new facilities were still under construction. The open letter protesting the transfer described the punishment meted out in this 1994 incident as grossly disproportionate and deeply harmful, arguing the women punished suffered very severe long-term emotional, psychological, mental, and physical abuse. And while the scheduled transfers of '97 were not themselves designed to be punitive, the open letter authors highlight that those transfers focused on women classified as in need of maximum security, and there were prisoners who only received that designation after the '94 incident. So they can make this through line where there are women in common across both moments. And the authors posit in their letter that the transfers were an extended form of punishment and asked pointedly, when are we women going to stop being inhumanely punished? All these years later, scholars and watchdogs have found that conditions in women's prisons have not meaningfully improved, and continue to replicate the traditional carceral model found in men's prisons. Healing lodges have not done away with prison culture either. Elders have opposed government intervention in healing lodge settings, especially when the intervention reintroduces hierarchical practice and limits the authority of the elder to maintain the space or guide programming. That's at least a broad summary of the failings that have been observed since the implementation of creating choices. These are problems that could be and have been traced back to the report rhetoric itself, rather than understood as happening despite report recommendations. Those 5 guiding principles: build self-esteem, make meaningful choices, respect guards, and so on. They positioned women as responsible for remedying their own inequality once they've been in a position where they're committing crimes. The correctional programming and architectural design found in women's prisons were arranged then to solve misogyny by rehabilitating survivors. And an approach like that to reform is reformist, to recall a previous speaker from this workshop series, and so described by him in writing. Rodriguez has written that the ideological and political position of reformism fixates on reform as the primary, if not exclusive, engine of social change. The prison activism featured in the Cell Count archive is particularly instructive in showing how carceral reform casts a shadow. The techniques that the Creating Choices report condemned were not lost in the restructuring of the federal women's correctional system. Those techniques instead continue to thrive in men's prisons, notwithstanding how harmful they are, and materialized as a threat to women. Women prisoners who make the wrong choices are undeserving of the reforms on offer in women's spaces like healing lodges and low security regional facilities. They can be pushed back into maximum security, open-ended segregation, tactical responses, and physical and sexual assault framed as protocol. Derica Purnell has warned that reformist reform encompasses changes that increase the power, scope, and legitimacy of the criminal legal system. So Creating Choices is not a failed text, given it's rather effective in reinvigorating carceral investment as a solution to violence against women. And that makes prison a palatable place to park federal funding earmarked for gender equality. The report justified the construction of new facilities and healing lodges, the operation of newly conceived in-prison and conditional release programming. Corrections Canada hired new staff retinues and cultivated partnerships to run the lodges. These funding priorities, incidentally or otherwise, came as First Nation reserves continue to grapple with impoverishment and Indigenous-led organizations lost government funding. There's an adage that might unfortunately suit this history: if you build it, and maybe if you build nothing else but this, they will come. And since the implementation of the report then, rates of incarcerating Indigenous women in particular have skyrocketed in Canada. They are our fastest growing prison demographic. General incarceration rates, regardless of gender, are already egregious, and Indigenous people, comprising about a third of the prison population, is a number that exists despite Indigenous people only being about 4% of Canada's general population. It's much worse for Indigenous women who, in the last 25 years, have come to represent almost half of our demographics in women's federal corrections. And I don't think it's a coincidence that these soaring incarceration rates coincide with the work that federal governments have done to implement carceral reforms. This is the legacy of Creating Choices, enabling and escalating mass incarceration. Prisons have been used to transfer and contain Indigenous populations to isolate them from their land and family and culture, and in the process have produced physical injury, poor health outcomes, and body counts. And there's a word for this. Canadian authorities have resisted using the term genocide, have resisted using the term genocide altogether once they finally admitted to cultural genocide. Diane Millian has argued that Indigenous people have been unable to claim genocide despite the starkness of the evidence for it, because the content of the term has a hard limit. It's rooted in events known for rapid violence. And she said that before this particular mass murder here referring to the Jewish Holocaust, there was no imaginary for genocide, no matter how many millions of American or African inhabitants died as a result of civilizing or enslavement campaigns. The conquering of the Americas is refused as primary genocide. The carceral system as itself a modern mechanism of this colonial project falls outside the definitional frame of genocide. It's still refused as genocide, given its violences can be slow acting, and the sudden violences still find justification as punishment. And in a reformist phase, justification takes new forms, rehabilitation. But the reforms we have explored in this presentation provided cover for a correctional system to continue its work, which work is described in Kelly Hernandez as purging, removing, caging, containing, erasing, disappearing, and eliminating targeted populations from land, life, and society. I'll conclude. Creating Choices was persuasive as a progressive text due to how effectively it appropriated feminist language and ideas, how effectively it presented as a solution for suffering. The document recommended incorporating gender responsivity and cultural sensitivity into contexts that are inherently violent, built to be violent, and are entirely incommensurate with healing. The failure of Creating Choices to identify Canada's correctional system as irredeemably violent meant the report essentially depoliticized the feminist strategies it adopted. Gender responsive, culturally sensitive carceral alternatives remain carceral at their core, even if they could improve the prison experience. These recommended reforms reinforce a system that by design extends disempowerment, cycles of dependency, and sustained abuse. My intentions today were not to disparage the report authors themselves or undercut their on-the-ground efforts to support incarcerated women. I'm left with some sympathy for Indigenous women activists who were recruited to inform Creating Choices. These women who imply in their preface they did so with clear eyes and some reluctance. It's entirely possible they, to quote Purnell, like want to believe that these reforms are gentle, or perhaps that a more diverse system will alleviate the suffering of the people who bear the brunt of the badge and the cage. It's just clear with enough distance from Creating Choices, reviewing its resulting historical trends, that carceral reform provides increasingly more effective ways to obscure and excuse violence. So feminist theorizing is tricky. It's at risk of becoming co-opted and unmoored and transmuted in the service of carcerality and colony. Those of us committed to this work of feminist theorizing might have some responsibility then to orient against reformism, to resist the use of our work for reformist causes. We might have to imagine bigger and with more courage.
Chukma, Hashsaka Chukma. Hi, everyone. It's good to be with you today. Many thanks to Shireen and Sarah and everyone involved in the organization of the Racial Violence Hub, which I know has been really generative for all of us. I appreciate the opportunity to comment on these two fascinating presentations, which I also had the opportunity to see on paper. And but in the interest of kind of shared dialogue and time, I'll try to keep my participation brief so we can have a good discussion. I'll start just by mentioning that I speak today from the lands of the Caddo and Wichita peoples in Norman, Oklahoma. So I'll start with Sylvia since she went first. Thanks for covering this important trial, Sylvia, and your careful examination of the dynamics that were at work in the pretrial portion of it. I closely followed the events of the trial largely vicariously through my close friend, who you may know, Irma Alicia Velasquez Nematu, who is a Quiche anthropologist and journalist who spent 2 years interviewing women in the community of Seprasarco and also provided expert witness testimony in the case. And she, like you, has written of her, of this dynamic of the state prioritization of state evidence, and she has repeatedly expressed her frustration about that prioritization over the women's testimonies. Does somebody need to be muted? Are others hearing that? So,
I think we took care of it.
Okay, great, thanks. I'll start with more of a comment that I would invite your response to. So the detailed and fairly nuanced analysis of the women's botting forth of Dominga Cook and her daughters and the others who died in the holes through their narrative testimony, in particular, in the particularly violent context of the court of law of the state and the particular modes of performance and witnessing that it entails, were really, really rich and generative for me. As I was reading that portion of the paper, I was also sort of uncomfortable, and I think that discomfort speaks to a difficult question that we've wrestled with some in the Racial Violence Hub, and that I personally have grappled with extensively in my own writing as an Indigenous woman who's been the subject of gender violence and has testified in court about it, and who has also written about Indigenous women's experience of violence. I was greatly concerned, and I think we've been concerned here with the questions of what, and Shireen mentioned this up front in her introduction, of whether we should be writing about this kind of violence, or how, perhaps more importantly, how to write about, how to represent such horrific harms without kind of reproducing them in some sense inadvertently. And so I wondered if you had, wanted to talk about maybe how you thought about that in the writing of this piece. And just to talk about it a little more specifically, my discomfort was with the description of the women's testimony, which was regularly accompanied by adjectives that seemed to kind of undermine the women's credibility, rather than what I think your intention was. And you can tell me if I'm wrong here, if I'm off base, but I think your intention was to highlight how their testimony was not credible to non-Indigenous actors in this court setting, right? So in other words, you set up the subjective testimony that the court can't render legible in some way, if it does in the same way that it does the ostensibly objective testimony of the forensic anthropologist, right? So, I felt concern about the representation of the women themselves, though, because the repeated use of terms linked to their testimony, like precarious or fragmentary or inconsistent or idiosyncratic, and the emphasis on kind of the performative, all seemed to me to make the women appear kind of quirky and compromised, right? And thus to take away from the substantial agency they demonstrated by testifying about their prolonged torture at all. So again, as someone who's grappled with how to write about such things, I would love your thoughts. And I've also been asked to speak to the question of agency in the women I wrote about. So that those things are always kind of at the forefront of my mind. So I would love to hear your thoughts about the choices you made in representing the women, and if you thought about how those descriptions might be read differently by differently positioned people, which is something I spent way too much time myself thinking about. So anyway, that's one question, or comment. But then, you turn in the paper to the forensic anthropology component, and which of course help me to understand where you were going with the precarity adjectives, but you highlight how the anthropologist forensics kind of scientific evidence is taken as proof that what the women have said is true. And this part struck me as a fairly straightforward critique of positivism and empiricism in Western law that, combined with the body four thing analysis, showed us how kind of subjective truth versus scientific super truth plays out in this kind of, legal context. Your conclusion, so I'm going to quote from your conclusion: the politics of forensic humanitarianism, forensic paternalism, and forensic anthropology's seemingly uncontestable capacity to produce super truths where survivors were able to only offer fragmentary and operatic accounts are also occluded from view. If trials entail an articulation of the juridical unconscious, as Spellman has suggested, what remains hidden or legally illegible is the way anthropological modes of witnessing may be implicated in these processes. The juridical unconscious at play in the Sepulcro pretrial hearings, therefore, also unsettles anthropology's relationship to the bodying forth in testimonial accounts and proximity to forensic witnessing and its aesthetics of revelation. So I kind of take away from that the politics of your analysis lay in some ways in a critique of, forensic anthropology and the knowledge that it produces and the ways it's accepted in these courts. But I wonder about the political implications of your analysis for Indigenous women who, again, even in the conclusion, appear only as fragmentary and operatic witnesses to their own experience. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, I think you do a really effective job of making clear that this legal arena is in some ways a setup for Indigenous women, right? Where their pain and suffering can only be, objectified and subjectified in the legal context. But what does that mean for them, right? I ask, particularly in light of the 2016 verdict, which resulted in the conviction and sentencing of a lieutenant colonel to 125 years in prison and a former military commissioner to 240 years in prison for crimes against humanity, forced disappearance, and the deaths of Dominga Coke and her daughters, right? So over, the course of 22 hearings, women testified in some sense, and in some sense, they were heard, right? They gained historic convictions and reparations that presumably they found meaningful. And that also revised the historical record on the conflict by formally acknowledging that sexual violence was a military tactic. So I don't think there's a black and white answer here, but I wondered what you feel is the takeaway for Indigenous women from your analysis. So you'll have a few minutes to think about that while I comment on Jen's paper. Jen, I really appreciated your thoughtful analysis of the Canadian carceral state and the ways in which the carefully constructed appearance of benevolence works, right? Even co-opting feminist discourses and Indigenous traditional practices to the task of enabling the expansion of mass incarceration as part of an overall policy of settler elimination, right? And most importantly, that overarching project of settler elimination is tantamount to genocide, right? And so for our purposes of our discussion here, I just want to first note that we should talk about, and I don't have a specific question for you on this, but we should talk more about the ways that slow violence and particularly carceral slow violence should be written into the definition of genocide, right? Because they clearly play such an important role in it. And I think your article, your text makes that really clear. So, that explicit linking of carcerality to genocide is such an important argument, right? And I think that the specific case that you address of the Creating Changes report and the programs that came out of it is really quite apt for showing how even an ostensible reform serves to further expand the genocidal imperatives of the carceral system. And I also agree with you that one might look to the work of Dylan Rodriguez on the problematics of reform. So first question, I have argued elsewhere that patriarchy and white supremacy are structuring logics of the settler state, and that this is why misogyny and racism remain persistently enduring, and why reform measures do little to change it. So it seems to me that what you describe in your article around creating changes, the Creating Changes report and the undertakings around it support that assertion. So do you want to comment on that, or maybe on the possibility of effective reform in Canada? And my second question is, and then I'm going to be quiet, I couldn't help comparing it to the United States. You know, you quote the powerful work of our colleague, Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who's made a similar argument about carcerality being genocidal in the US, where the carceral state is equally engaged in practices of you know, removing, caging, containing, disappearing, erasing, eliminating. And yet, the US public discourse, far from being about benevolence, is about criminality and punishment. And those seem like really distinct approaches to carcerality and to the rendering of it as acceptable or palpable, you know, in kind of the public mind. So do you have any thoughts on that, and on why this fundamental difference in approach to what I would think of as shared settler objectives? So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your talks.
Thanks, Shannon. And perhaps we'll give each of you a chance to respond separately before opening it up. So Sylvia, do you like to?
Yeah, thank you so much for those incredibly insightful and very helpful comments. And the way I can perhaps respond is to say that, of course, I'm familiar with you know, the really very important work that's already out there on the Sepur-Sarko case. It's been a very important case, a point of reference that has produced a number of analyses, and indeed in the longer paper, I discussed the literature that's emerged around Sepur-Sarko in detail. And so the point perhaps that I can perhaps clarify is what is particularly interesting is to think about Sepur-Sarko as the case that indeed did lead to the convictions. I mean, Reyes was convicted. I mean, the man responsible for the death of the woman who I say emerges in this very fragmentary way in the pretrial hearings actually is convicted in the end. But I think what's particularly interesting is to actually return to this pretrial phase and to see the trial as the culmination of a very long process. And so something specifically interesting happens in this pretrial moment where there is no defendant. It's a very strange juridical scene because there are two parties. There is a prosecution, but there is no defendant. And there are witnesses who are seeking to make a case. And so the only way that I can enter ethnographically the scene is through this scene that's already set. It's a juridical scene. It is a scene of the law. It is a scene where forensic analysis counts, and the witnesses have to labor in order to make themselves heard through the rhetoricity that is heard from the law, by the law. So that's what I have to describe. And that's the complexity of the ethnographic description, because what I'm effectively describing is a scene of violence. This is why I was saying at the beginning, it may appear that the pretrial hearing is a scene of justice. But actually, my contention is that it is not a scene of justice. It is a scene which is profoundly violent, in which witnesses have to be, you know, their contributions and the positions have to be translated. There have to be a certain performance of this theater of justice that Shoshana Feldman draws our attention to. So I acknowledge from the very start that it is an ethnographic description that has to handle the fact that it is a violent process that I am tackling. So it is within that I had to make certain choices as to what I would leave in the description and what I would perhaps not mark and leave leave out. So I made certain choices in that respect. So it is a scene really about the rhetoricity that's expected of the witnesses. And in that respect, it is the way in which I emphasize fragmentarily. I don't mean that the witnesses speak in fragments, but I do mean that the law is expecting a linearity in the account, and that cannot always be provided because memory is haphazard in places. And that's part of what's happening in that particular moment. So that is what I describe in the piece. Now, this is not to say that I think the witnesses are unable to speak their truth. I think they speak truth. It's just that a certain set of expectations is already there before they enter the scene, and certain expectations are there. And the lawyers, even lawyers who have worked with them over years in order to coach, in order to make the position understood in that context, incite and request a certain type of narrative. And sometimes the witness does not provide it. And so that is what I'm observing. Now, what is there for the indigenous women who took part in the trial? Why do I return to this case when, of course, there were 2 convictions? Yes, to some extent, this is a successful case. There were 2 convictions, but I do think it is worthwhile reflecting on the violence of the process, nevertheless. Because whilst one might say, actually, in this case, the person who was responsible for the death of Dominga was actually convicted, nevertheless, the juridical process is inherently violent. And I think that has to be said. And perhaps that might lead to, or might point to, different modes of justice, which are sometimes evoked in certain moments in the exchanges, and that I point to in my paper. And so maybe that's a suggestion for different modes of juridical processing that might not be as violent as this, at least at the way in which this was in that particular moment of the pretrial proceedings. I don't think that the trial is equivalent to the pretrial, but the pretrial is particularly interesting to have a sense of this, of the really iterative process and the violence that entails. I hope that's sufficient.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Jen?
First, Shannon, thank you so much for taking the time to read through my very drafty draft work and to provide insight. Maybe if I'm permitted, I did want to note that Sylvia, your excellent talk on how legal space works as a certain entry point into justice and testimony. I mean, it did really speak to me, and in particular, like this language around like fragmentary truth has echoes in some of the work I have done with institutional survivors who have intellectual disabilities and have organized a class action lawsuit that could not go to court because they weren't considered credible witnesses of their own experiences of pretty dramatic daily violence. So I've been thinking a lot myself about like what constitutes truth and like how do we facilitate testimony and what role does the witness play in like actively supporting survivors of violence to tell stories that won't be discounted or undermined, particularly like in the settings where they get to tell those stories. And courtrooms seem to not serve that kind of function because truth telling that is lauded as you know, the kind of testimony that can proceed and be believed comes with all kinds of conditions. So thank you for providing such a clarifying theoretic frame that I can use in my own work. maybe I'll turn to my own questions from Shannon. It does seem true that there's a kind of like marrying of patriarchal and white supremacist values that like sit at the heart of a settler colonial state formation. And I think in the Canadian context, this kind of the kind of gendered impacts that settler colonialism has brought to bear have like been clear, particularly with Indigenous feminist organizing. We've seen a lot of work being done on or to rectify the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the way in which we've seen Indigenous women disappeared across even recent Canadian history. And we've also seen a great deal of violence wrought against women in community that has no redress or remedy, a way in which like Vancouver's downtown east side has served as a hunting ground without any kind of response from the state itself. That was work that had to be done on the ground to protect community because a settler colonial state is not built in a way that can respond meaningfully to the mass disappearances of peoples who are marked by indigeneity and gender. Which is why I think it's probably valuable to pay heed to how like the failures of state responses mean that, you know, documents and work being done to reform state responses are going to fail us. Even when they incorporate Indigenous voices, even when they're building healing lodges on sites, which have been called a kind of perverse carceral tool, a way of perverting Indigenous knowledge and co-opting it in, you know, in the service of continuing the work of genocide. So, you know, however much like we see the efforts to use the right language, the efforts to involve the right people, that is, it's never going to work structurally, because what we have as an end point is the continual work of upholding empire. And then maybe I wanted to know, and this might speak to my work again on institutional violence, because my pivot into carceral work is new. I was trying something new for this workshop as directed. There does seem to be a kind of distinct difference to you know, approaching like it's the philosophy of a carceral system that's built to punish versus built to rehabilitate. And yet I think they're related. I think there's a kind of continuum. I'm not sure how distinct they are, because in total institutional spaces, not even just in prison context, but say in the context that have institutionalized disabled people, or we've seen with, I'm building a kind of anthology on total institutions across Canada that include, you know, prisons and, you know, our Japanese internment camps. And I have an author here who's done work on sheltered labor. These are spaces where care has been used as a kind of tool or technique that can justify violence. Violence is wrought on bodies marked by difference, can be done in the name of care, in the name of benevolence, in the name of rehabilitation. And, you know, that might be a different kind of philosophical approach, a different way of framing in contrast with punishment or even like sadism, but the outcomes are the same. So I think that there is a kind of continuum where like we see in spaces that build cultures of violence, that care is often a kind of go-to, approach to justify the techniques that are perennial, that are endemic to those spaces. And then when people step out of bounds, when they are incapable of compliance, then punishment is still available to turn to. So we still see a kind of resentment and disdain for the groups that end up in spaces that are being managed or rehabilitated or cared for. I might just pause there.
Thank you. I have questions like just brimming up to here. So, but I really would like to open it up at this point to those listening. If you have questions that you would like to either pose directly or put in the chat, I'm welcome to. I'm happy to pose them on your behalf. So please either put up your hand or go into the chat if you have questions for the panelists and the commentators at this point. And while I'm waiting for that to happen, if it's going to happen, I am. So one of the things that I'm finding really important in this discussion is the way in which, so Sylvia, you talked about in your response to Shannon, different modes of justice operating at the same time. And Jen, you were talking about, the dynamic that you are wanting to emphasize between punishment and rehabilitation. And I'm actually just sort of writing a piece right now on what we can learn from the inquest or the inquiry, and what we can learn, having this discussion with Carmela Mordoka, who I think is still on. Yes, what we can learn from the inquest or the inquiry in settler societies is that the dynamic of improvement, my last book was called Dying from Improvement. So the improvement, the rehabilitating, the fixing, the generous state that will actually step in and provide some form of justice is actually very core to the settler project all along. We didn't have to wait for the liberal turn. It's always been there. You always have those, colonizers always come in those varieties. And what is important about the law for me is if this is like structurally built into the law, so that from day one, we're going to be hearing about the gentle, efficient, effective, colonizer who really cares for the natives. From day one, we have that dynamic. No wonder we end up with these multiple modes. No wonder we end up with, these perverse carceral tools. I love that phrase. I want to cite it. So you need to send me the source. In fact, the law really, that is what it provides. It provides an opportunity to use these perverse tools. And maybe to go back to Shannon's point, maybe anthropologists or expert witnesses, the main requirement of us is that we are, and I'm saying we because I have been called to be an expert witness, is that we provide this perverse colonial tool, which will enable the state to give a few things and take them back a while later. The big question that I guess I just open up for discussion there is, my God, what are we to do? I'm always asked this question every time people say things like, what are you recommending? No charges, no, how do you get the violence to pause? What are you actually recommending here? So anyway, I wondered if you undoubtedly get that yourself, all of you. And I wonder how we think about that in fact, the dynamic of repair, the dynamic of improvement amounts to the same thing all the time because of the structure.
I can start. Thank you, Shireen. Maybe I'll note that the chapter of yours from Dying from Improvement that I assign to my class all the time talks about like the way the text embeds this presumption that Indigenous peoples were doomed to die. That there's a kind of natural flaw in their inability to like keep up with modernization, in their inability to fit into civilization that has resulted in their freezing deaths on the Saskatchewan plains. And I think maybe that kind of presumption of natural inadequacy is folded into the problem of the dynamic of improvement, that by which I mean colonizing forces and forces tasked with sort of like mass management and mass care of populations that find themselves institutionalized or interned or incarcerated are always doomed to fail to be improved. They're never going to live up to the expectations of state. So it is a game where the cards are certainly stacked against them. So the violence done in order to improve a people is always paired with the impossibility of ever living up to that expectation, which itself comes with its own violences, because your failure to enter into civilization as the ideal citizen, your inability to leave a carceral space and then being blamed for it is going to invite more kinds of violences. Yeah, maybe I'll note that, I mean, like abolitionist texts are becoming really popular these days. They're finding their way into our zeitgeist, maybe because there is a new kind of public turning on at least police, if not prisons. And yeah, the question of what are we to do, and what would we do without carceral responses is what comes up again and again and again. And maybe like if I'm going to look to the experts on these subjects, I'd note that like we don't have a one-size-fits-all solution, because the alternatives to carceral responses exist in community and some of them haven't been imagined yet. So I am all but positive some of the work of abolition on Canadian soil involves yielding sovereignty to First Nations peoples. It does involve like a settler colonial state and its impossibility to ever be anything but violent means that it does need to be dissolved in order for communities that have been so deeply wronged at the core and foundation of the Canadian project, like they have potentially the answers in their own communities, or have the kind of brain power to like do the work to find different kinds of justice models, kinds of transformative work that can address harm and address injury and address violence in some ways that don't keep reproducing harm and injury and violence. Maybe I should stop there.
Sylvia, do you have anything?
Yes, perhaps I can comment on the relationship between dying from improvement and dying from repair and care, because there's I mean, we can think, I mean, I spoke about the law, but in the latter part of the paper, I was particularly focused on this question of forensics. And whilst, yes, it is fairly straightforward to offer a critique of forensics as a kind of positivist epistemology, there is also a broader point about forensics that's being posited as a technology of repair of communities, repair of relations, the remaking of bonds that are interrupted or broken by histories of violence, that can be reconnected by this forensic magic of being able to produce matches between remains and survivors and so on and so forth. So I think it's interesting to think not just about the law, but also about forensics as a technology of care, a technology of repair, which I think actually is implicated in these violent processes in the same way as the law is. And I think that has to be posed not just as a critique of positivism, which is fairly straightforward to do, but as I was trying to suggest in the paper, you can see how forensic aesthetics actually move from the lab into the public sphere. They give ground to the popular imaginings of the conditions of possibility of giving victims a face, giving victims back a name, and so on and so forth. And I think we need to think more about what's in play there. And there's a space for perhaps thinking in more subtle ways about the problems with forensic as a narrative that promises a certain horizon of repair, when in fact is often not able to produce it and deliver it, because actually we know that forensics very often produces remains, but the matches are very few. And indeed, actually, forensics is a is a technology of production of forensic archives, and not necessarily of matches and the connections between remains and communities. So I think there's more than we can. I think there's probably more work and thinking that can go into both law and forensics as allegedly technologies of repair that actually have very violent dimensions to them, which are not always spoken about because of this very dominant narrative of forensic humanitarianism that inhibits a kind of critical engagement with forensic discourses.
Shannon, I don't know if you wanted to comment on any of this, and if there's any other anyone wanting to speak.
I mean, I can comment on this. So thank you for those responses. This was really clarifying for me and interesting. And I'm still thinking in my mind in terms of your analysis, Sylvia, what it brings us to, right? So I think, it's obviously important to analyze the violence in law and legal processes, and as well as in, processes, forensic processes, and particularly as they conjunct the law, I think. But at the same time, where does, I keep thinking, where does that leave Indigenous women or Indigenous people who have been subject to violence, who want to pursue justice? Like, in some ways it's like, okay, so if it's inherently violent to go through this process, so one would think, Indigenous women should avoid that, right? Like avoid putting themselves into a context that will be inherently, violent and do new violence to them. But then, so what's the alternative? Is the lesson to just not pursue justice? Or, how do we come to ways of seeking justice that avoid new subjectification? I don't know if that's not necessarily a question for you, Sylvia, but for the larger group, if people have thoughts on it.
I think that where this takes me is the question that I feel is left a bit hanging is that, as a person who looks at sort of modes like the inquest and the inquiry and so on, I'm just wondering what my analysis would be if I focus on sites like Sylvia does, or that Shannon has talked about. Like, does it make a difference that it's genocide? that we're trying to put on the table. It's genocide that we're trying to put on the table for inquests and inquiries as well. But there's something about, is there something about being able to give it a name, a particular name? You know, I just don't know where that stands. Would anyone like to have the last word on that? No?
I'll say I struggled with that myself, thinking about how to imagine the work I'm doing to make sense of colonial carcerality as a kind of genocidal project. I mean, I did a bunch of reading on genocidal studies to try to like situate the work, and thought, I mean, it takes effort for us to do the work of like expanding or contesting the kinds of definitional limits to genocide. And we have this kind of desire to challenge the term because it's a legal category that comes with like real implications and recognition of a kind of truth that gets buried. And when we think about, I mean, when I've read work like Diane Milley, and I think a lot about how like the kinds of violences that happened on American soil, on North American soil, feel like deeply so a kind of violence against a range of peoples. And yet, like, it does feel like even that orientation of trying to expand a kind of legal category like reminds me of the work that I've seen done in queer spaces to recognize violence as hate crimes because of the kinds of legal results that can generate. It's aligned with the kinds of carceral feminisms that maybe some of the work I've seen in this workshop has been trying to avoid, where the feminist theorizing we're doing is not done to the ends of upholding or expanding carceral violences or police violences. So I think I struggled with that with my own presentation, trying to imagine how to position the work done to theorize violence in relation to genocide, if we're trying to think about like what the purposes are to trying to fit into that term. It seems like the term hasn't been available to whole ranges of peoples who have experienced mass state-based violence, and yet, like, if the work that we're trying to do is to imagine different kinds of responses, different kinds of community-based sources of support and justice, maybe the term itself is not what we need.
I am struck, and I will say this as sort of the organizer of this series. The premise, of course, is what you call it matters. And if you call it hate or if you call it genocide, it really matters where that actually goes in law. But what I'm really struck by is that at several moments, which I won't specify for obvious reasons, it has been ill-advised for some of our speakers to use the word genocide because they would be persecuted for it. And that has been no more telling indicator that it matters what you call it. It even matters, you know, academics often think that, you know, maybe nobody's even caring what we say or do. And in fact, they are caring quite a bit about whether we call it genocide or not. And so that, you know, has really struck me. I feel impossibly naive because although this comes at me in various ways for the last 25 years, I'm still shocked that there are so many consequences to this. So with that, I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank Sarah Montoya for managing this. And of course, we had to manage it a little extra today. I would like to thank Shannon Speed for coming, you know, in spite of being on sabbatical. And most of all, a very big thank you to Dr. Sylvia Posocco and Jen Rinaldi for their very fabulous presentations, lots of food for thought. And I know that we will go away. I've got a number of things myself, to check and help me. It's always all about helping me, etc. So thanks very much to everyone, and thanks to the audience for listening in. And please join us again on April 1st.